Joining us now from Israel is Haaretz journalist Amir Tabon, author of the new book, and we can put up E2 here, The Gates of Gaza, which is part memoir, part history of Israel, Palestine. Terrific book. Amir, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and just to set the context for people, I don't know if you even remember this. It was so long ago. If we could put up E4 here. This is an old magazine that I co-founded called HuffPost Highline. Amir wrote this really great profile of the relationship between Benjamin Netanyahu and Barack Obama, and how it really collapsed in acrimony over the course of his presidency. And if you squint there, you can see contributed reporting by Ryan Grimm.
Indeed.
Indeed. So Amir and I worked on that story together, and a few collaborations afterwards. I always followed your work from Israel. Amir is one of the best sourced reporters, kind of in the political space over there, and I still remember waking up on Saturday, October 7th, and because we are, I guess 6 hours or so, ahead, like so much had unfolded while we slept in the United States. One of the first things that I saw on social media was that you and your family, had been trapped in this safe house safe room in Nahal Oz, which is the kibbutz which is closest to the border of Gaza. And I can only imagine how many times you've told this story by this point. We're a year later, and the book is heavily, weaves this story through. But for viewers who are unfamiliar with it, can you just tell them what is Nahal Oz, and briefly what was October 7th like? And people should really read the book and get the full story. But I wanted people to have the context for this conversation.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks for the opportunity to discuss it. And as much as it's not easy to talk about it again and again, I also feel it's an obligation I have. So Nahal Oz is a small Israeli community. You can think of it as a village or a very small town located within the internationally recognized borders of Israel, right across the border from the Gaza Strip. It's home to about 450 people, including my family, me, my wife, and our 2 young daughters. We have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. And this community was attacked by Hamas on October 7th as part of that widespread Hamas invasion into Israel on that Saturday morning. Within our community, out of 450 people, 15 were murdered on that day. That would be 3.5% of the total population. So try to think of a small town, a village, or a neighborhood in the US losing 3.5% of the population in one day. That's basically what happened in Nahal Oz. 7 people were kidnapped from the kibbutz, and out of them, 5 were released alive in late November after more than 50 days held by Hamas, thanks to the hostage deal orchestrated at the time by President Biden. There are still 2 hostages from our community, fathers of young children, friends of mine, Omri Miran and Tzachi Idan, who are in the hands of Hamas. My family survived that day, and I tell in the book the story of how and what happened and how we were forced to remain in this little room in complete darkness, no electricity, no food, with the 2 girls, at the time 3.5 and 2 years old, for the entire day, basically, and to keep them quiet so that the terrorists who were firing in our living room will not hear us. Quite a story. And like you said, Ryan, what I tried to do in the book is to tell that story, but also the history that preceded it, and in my analysis led to it, the history of the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians and the relationships across the 2 sides of the Israel-Gaza border.
Yeah, and I have the book open in front of me right now. It's really gripping. There are a lot of people who purport to speak for the victims on October 7th, people who lived through the horrors that you lived through. How different, and even just the people who have been rescued as hostages, for example, as you mentioned, you're in touch with people. In fact, you are one of the survivors of October 7th. How different do you feel the conversation has been among people who survived that day versus sort of the broader media discourse?
And that's such a smart question. And I think that anybody who has lived through an event will often feel that the media coverage of the event is a bit weird. And I've been hearing that for years as a journalist, writing about many different things. I've also covered wars in Ukraine and Syria and the Kurdish region. And this is not necessarily a criticism, but a comment that I've heard from people over the years that when you are actually part of a story, the way it's portrayed in the media, even if it's the greatest reporting and the most professional and accurate description, it sometimes feels just a little off. And I think that when I talk to my neighbors, my friends who survived this attack, or when I talk to friends who lost their loved ones on that day, who had people from their family kidnapped into Gaza, there's just some kind of an understanding between the people who went through this that is very, very hard to summarize in articles or television segments. And I felt like the book was my attempt to also bring that story in more words. It's not a very long book, but still, it offers more space than a regular newspaper article to describe the events, the emotions, and also the aftermath and the scars that it left on all the people who were there.
And so another thing that struck me about October 7th and the victims was the way that, and you can explain more of the kind of political details around the political kind of texture around this, but a lot of the people in your community and a lot of the other kibbutzim in the surrounding area are kind of left-wing, liberal-leaning people who are supportive of Palestinian rights, Palestinian dignity, opposed to, in general, the occupation, and would like to see a two-state solution, both sides living side by side. Some of them were active in activism within Gaza, like taking patient, because if you're in Gaza and you have a life-threatening illness or a health complication, you need the permission of Israeli authorities to travel outside of it. And so some would go in and help bring people out. Some of those people ended up being either taken hostage or victims of this. And so it's not as if somebody who has right-wing, terrible politics deserves to be killed as a civilian or taken hostage, but there's something extra kind of poignant about people who are kind of sympathetic to the Palestinian cause and who are deeply hostile to Netanyahu government being the victims of Netanyahu's failure down in the south. And then as I was thinking that through, and I'm curious for your answer to this, why do those types of people live there in the first place, so close to this kind of constant reminder of the horrifying reality of the occupation and the siege? How did that happen?
Yeah, I know this is one of the complexities of Israeli politics and society, and how it is wildly different in many ways than the politics and the culture of the United States. And just to give perhaps a name and a face to this discussion before I get into the politics of it, you can think as an example of Vivian Silver, very famous peace activist from Be'eri, kibbutz 15 minutes from Nahal Oz, not far from my home. And she was one of the founders of an organization called Women Wage Peace, which was fighting against the occupation in favor of better relations between Israel and the Palestinians, and of attempting to help bring about peace in the region. And she was murdered on October 7 by Hamas, a woman who devoted her life really to promoting peace between Israelis and Palestinians, and eventually was murdered by these terrorists in her house in kibbutz Be'eri. Now, if we take her as an example, you can ask Ryan, well, why would a person who has devoted their life really to the purpose of peace decide to live in this border community that to many Israelis is a signal of the need for security and protecting the border from the enemies on the other side. But a way that is unique to this conflict and to the geography of this land, the two things to an Israeli would actually really make sense, because communities like Nachal Oz, like Be'eri, like Kibbutz Nir Oz, which was also attacked on that day and had the highest number of casualties, people who were murdered or kidnapped. These were communities that were built on the Israeli side of the border, not within the Gaza Strip, not on disputed land that Israel took after the Six-Day War. And these are not communities that were built out of some desire to, basically strip the Palestinians of their rights, but actually out of the belief that Israel needs to have a border, and that on the other side of that border, you can have an independent Palestinian state that we can have peaceful relations with, just like the US has a border with Canada, and France today has a border with Germany, although that's a very, very relaxed border. Maybe one day the Israeli-Palestinian border will be the same, and we won't even need a passport to move between the countries. I don't foresee that very soon, but it can be an ambition for the future. And so for the people living there, it actually made sense. This ideological Zionist, really, that's the word to use, belief in the importance of strong, secure borders for the state of Israel, and at the same time, a belief in the necessity of peace and dignity and a good life for the people on the other side, because without that, we are doomed to constant cycles of war.
And you talk in the book about the decision to move down there from Tel Aviv in 2014, and which was around the time we were doing the reporting for that piece. And you talk about how there was this several month-long invasion war in 2014, and Nahal Oz was evacuated during that because it's under constant shelling. And as people thought that the war was approaching a ceasefire, people had been away for so long that they were impatient to return. One family came back early. A shell landed in Nahal Oz, exploded, shrapnel went through a window and killed, I believe, a 4-year-old child who became the face of the kind of the tragedy of that war, across Israel, and led to then a number of families leaving that community, and then later later that year you decide you're gonna move in. And what struck me, and probably you too, as you were writing this, I'm curious, was that this was a horrifying tragedy that captivated the attention of the entire country, while dozens of children, were killed yesterday in Gaza, kind of namelessly, not namelessly to the families of those in Gaza, but we're not leading the press coverage with them here in the United States.
This is E1. We can
we can put up the
footage.
Here. We're not. It's not international attention, and we're approaching, probably in Gaza, a similar percentage. You talked about 3.5% of the community being killed. The death rate in Gaza may be that at this point of the 2 million people. And we were talking before you joined here about how, because this is still going on, nobody has really had a chance to kind of process what has happened, because we're still living through it. So how do you square in your mind the horrific tragedies that you've lived through and that you've witnessed, and square them with the kind of exponentially greater scale just a mile away?
So I'll divide this into 3 levels, perhaps. First of all, there is the emotional level. And putting aside the politics and the justifications that Israel had for the war, and to be frank, I supported the war in the beginning after October 7, because I really felt Israel had no choice but to retaliate militarily very strongly to what Hamas did. But I'll get to that in a second. On the emotional level, it's terrible. It's horrendous. It's an immense tragedy. It's heartbreaking. I can go on and on with the words, but the the pictures themselves, I think, speak louder than anything. And by the way, I've visited Nachal Oz many times since October 7. We don't live there at the moment. The kibbutz cannot really be inhabited by families with children. But whenever I go there, I see the destruction on the other side because Nachal Oz is so close to Gaza that you can really see with your eyes the destruction on the other side of the border. And, I'm not happy about it. I don't find anything to celebrate about it. I think it's heartbreaking, and I understand also that it will have repercussions for the future because now the Gaza Strip is home to more than 2 million people who are living among this epic destruction. On the logical level, I do understand that after October 7, Israel had to go to war against Hamas. Because what Hamas did on that day, massacre of civilians, a breach of the border, and the kidnapping of more than 200 people, that was not something Israel could just say, well, okay, it happened and now we're moving on, fresh page. We can debate whether the war should now continue or not. I'm on the camp that says the most urgent thing to do right now is a deal to end the war and release the hostages. And I've been writing this for months, actually. I've been writing this for months in Haaretz, and I've been speaking about it in other platforms. I really think the urgency, ending the killing and the suffering, and bringing back our hostages to Israel and allowing the beginning of a process to rebuild, reconstruct, fix the damages on both sides of the border is really, really urgent. That's the best I can say about it. And then I think on the third level, this is the geopolitical level, I think we need a plan to rise from this disaster, because if we spend now all of our time debating who had it worse and who committed bigger crimes, there are no winners in that debate. And it doesn't really lead us to a place where people in Gaza and in Israel can get over this disastrous, horrendous, ongoing event. What we really need is a plan for the day after. Okay, we need to finish the war, release the hostages, and then start thinking about the day after. What do we do to improve the reality in Gaza and in Israel, and to make sure that something like this never happens again? And honestly, right now, that's my biggest concern, apart from the, again, urgency, stopping the killing, bringing back the hostages, including my two friends. My biggest long-term concern is we don't really have any kind of plan for what comes next and how we avoid this situation repeating itself in a year or 2 or 3 down the road.
And Ryan, do you want to cue up this clip of you talking to Matt Miller at the State Department briefing yesterday about the UAE and Israel?
Yeah, we can get your reaction to this so we can roll this.
The mercenaries plan.
Yeah, well, it's part of the mercenaries plan, yeah, or it appears to be. We can roll this shot from the State Department yesterday.
Commented earlier on how the letter that you guys sent in mid-October to Israel mentions suggests that they not pass the UNRWA ban. Right above that, in that same letter, bullet point 3 of the 3 bullet points says that Israel should also end isolation of northern Gaza by reaffirming that there will be no Israeli government policy of forced evacuations of civilians from northern to southern Gaza, ensuring humanitarian organizations have continuous access to northern Gaza through northern crossings and from southern Gaza. Obviously, the 30 days isn't up, but 2 weeks ago, the situation in northern Gaza was bad. Like today, it's utterly dystopian. The opposite of making progress has happened there. Somebody mentioned the 109 civilians killed in this residential building as part of this forced evacuation. So it seems like neither of those two things have happened. And in fact, they've gone the opposite direction. Do you need the 30 days to make an assessment on at least that bullet?
So we have made clear that the situation in northern Gaza, which is what that bullet refers to, needs to change. And Secretary Blinken made clear directly to the Prime Minister last week that the situation in northern Gaza needs to change, that we need to see everyone in northern Gaza, every civilian in northern Gaza have access to food and water and other humanitarian assistance, and we're going to continue to make that clear.
You started with the RSF and the most recent war crimes. UAE is one of the strongest backers of the RSF. You guys are very tight with the UAE. Why can't the U.S. pressure the UAE to put a stop to this? It's
So
just,
we have
how
made
long is this going to
we
go
have
on?
made clear to every country in the region, every country around the world, that no country should do anything to prolong this conflict, including providing arms to either of the warring parties.
It just seems like countries in that region just aren't interested. Like maybe they listen, but they just don't follow the advice that we're.
Look, every country makes its own decisions on a host of foreign policy issues. But I can tell you that the thing that the secretary heard time and time again as we were in the region last week is that partner after partner welcomed our engagement because we are the only ones who could play this critical role of trying to end conflicts in Gaza.
So about 2 weeks ago, there was this big letter from the Secretary Austin and Secretary Blinken really laying down the gauntlet. Like, these are the things that we really must see, or there are going to be consequences. And two of them that I mentioned there in the State Department, one, do not ban UNRWA, and do not do a forced evacuation of northern Gaza. In the 2 weeks since, they banned UNRWA, and they did a forced evacuation of the north. Can you tell us from the Israeli government perspective, why do they keep doing this? Like, what happened to the U.S. that the U.S. isn't kind of calling the shots anymore here? Or is the U.S. okay with this?
First of all, I'll say about UNRWA that this is bigger than the U.S. because on the UNRWA legislation, Israel has also heard from other allies, the U.K., Germany, Arab countries that we have close relationships with. Everybody advocated against this legislation, and the government ignored it. Regarding the forced evacuation in northern Gaza, here I have to say I do think Biden did get something with that warning because the population that was removed from the area of Jabalia, which is north of Gaza City, was not pushed south of the Netzarim corridor, which is today the main dividing line between northern and southern Gaza. And there is this plan advocated by the far-right elements of the Netanyahu government to push the population from northern Gaza across that specific corridor, that road, into southern Gaza. That has not happened. And I do think the letter by the secretaries had an impact because the population moved a little south, but still within the boundaries of what we would call northern Gaza. So that's just, to put the difference between the two things. And now on the big picture, Ryan, I'll tell you honestly, I think that Netanyahu at some point during the war, I would say around December, January, decided to take a bet. And the bet was on Donald Trump winning the election in the United States. And he told himself, I will now suffer through a year of, all kinds of, messaging, and they'll tell me that I'm doing terrible things, and Blinken will call, and Biden will call, and State Department will call me out in the briefings. And maybe they'll hold some weapons at some point, which they did for 2 months before the invasion of Rafah. But at the end of the day, their fear of losing the election to Trump will allow me to get away with a lot of things. And eventually, if he will win, I could get away with even more. I think this is the bit that he played.
Right.
We'll know next week if it actually worked out for him.
So what does that mean then let's say his bet is wrong and Kamala wins? What does that mean for his strategy going forward?
I believe if Kamala Harris wins the U.S. election, Netanyahu's government will collapse within a matter of very few months. In order to remain in power, Netanyahu needs to do two things. First of all, it's important for the viewers to understand how different Israeli politics is than American politics, right? In your politics, you have an election. Every 4 years, somebody gets elected president, and unless they are impeached or they die, they will serve out their term. In Israel, we have coalition politics. We have a multi-party system, and the prime minister is very powerful, but at the same time can lose power any second if the parties that basically make up his coalition decide they no longer align with him. Netanyahu's survival in power after October 7 relies on two political forces within his coalition, the ultra-religious far right and what we call the ultra-Orthodox, which is another very, very religious segment of the Jewish population. Both of these parties have very specific interests and demands from Netanyahu that require him ultimately to do two things. Number one is to build settlements in Gaza. This is the demand of the far-right elements of his coalition. Number two is to significantly weaken the democratic guardrails within Israel like the Supreme Court and all the other mechanisms that really separate Israel from the other countries in the region, making it the only democracy in the Middle East, as we like to pride ourselves. And you may recall, and the viewers may recall, that before October 7th, for an entire year, the biggest news story out of Israel was the attempts by Netanyahu's coalition to weaken Israel's democratic institutions and provide much more power to themselves, to the government. If Kamala Harris wins the election, both of those things will simply not happen. He will not be able to build settlements in Gaza because the US will put a glaring red line on that, and there will be no more elections to take into consideration, and the fear of being tough on Israel and then losing middle-of-the-road voters for Trump, that will be out the window. Settlements in Gaza will simply not happen, and she will be able to use leverage to stop that in ways that I think Biden has been hesitant or fearful of doing because of the election. And the same goes for crushing the democratic institutions inside Israel, which is really necessary for these ultra-religious parties because they want to reshape the country. So I think that from his point of view, he knows pretty much that if she wins, his coalition collapses. He will not be able to fulfill the demands of his partners. If Trump wins, honestly, it's anyone's bet what will happen. I mean, the guy is so unexpected, so unstable, has a history specifically on the Israeli issue, by the way, of, saying one thing and then saying the opposite and doing, I mean, everything is up in the air. But I do believe that Netanyahu thinks he can get away with a lot more with Trump, and that he can sell to him the settlements in Gaza as condos on the beach, which it will be anything but, think about Trump.
Kushner
and that
style,
Trump really wouldn't care if Israel became more like Russia and less like the Western democracy that it wants to be. He wouldn't shed a tear.
Right.
So that's Netanyahu's gamble, basically.
And so if Kamala wins and Netanyahu's government does collapse subsequently, what political forces are arrayed to be able to replace it? Like what comes next if that happens? Do those two forces on the far right have enough other access to power, or would there be some type of center right, Yair Lapid situation? What replaces him?
It would not be replaced by a left-wing progressive government. I can tell you, as a left-wing Israeli, this is not realistic right now, not at all. But I do believe there could be a center-right government that would be more like the government we had in Israel for about a year and a half after Netanyahu lost power in 2021 and before his comeback in late 2022. It was a centrist government that had a moderate right-wing element and moderate left-wing element, and it was, in terms of policy, much more, let's say, careful and certainly on internal issues, much less provocative and extreme. And I do believe that a coalition like that could rise to power again in Israel, and it will not include Netanyahu himself or the far-right ultra-religious elements that he relies on to have power. It could, by the way, include once again a party representing segment of the Arab Muslim population in Israel. I mean, that previous government we had about 2 years ago, it was historical in one sense that there was a cooperation there between right-wing, centrist, left-wing parties, and also one party representing Arab Muslim citizens of Israel. And even after the shocks of October 7 and the war, I can still see that configuration returning. But, all of this is hypothetical. First of all, we have to see what happens in your election, and then to get to a point where Israel also has an election. We still don't have confirmation about any of that.
Would that post-Netanyahu government move toward ending the war?
I think the war will...
It seems like the support, tell me if I'm wrong, the support for continuing the war seems almost universal. Not universal, but close to it.
Yeah.
It's complicated. I think most Israelis, if you just ask them right now, do you agree to stop the war? They will say no. But if you ask them, do you agree to stop the war in return for a deal that brings us back all the hostages? Polling in Israel shows an overwhelming majority for this position. We're talking, some polls have it in the high 50s, others in the 60s, and I've even seen in the 70s in terms of percentage of the population that would say, okay, regardless of the fact that there are still terrorists in Gaza, of course, I mean, look what's happening there. Okay, but regardless of the fact that there's still a threat to Israel from other enemies in the north, in the east, we have 100 hostages there. And if we don't bring them back soon, they are all going to die. And we will not even be able to locate some of their graves because the people who held them are also dying in the war. So when you present it like that, you actually have a majority, the Israeli society, that will say, okay, for a deal that brings us back the hostages, we are willing to stop this war. The problem is that for Netanyahu, stopping the war basically means losing power. If he stops the war, the far-right elements in his coalition immediately bring down the government. And it's heartbreaking and enraging, but in making the choice between his own political survival and the fate of the hostages, he has made his choice. And it's not the patriotic Zionist, Israel-loving choice that I would expect a leader of this country to make, and to prioritize the lives of our hostages.
Right. Well, we'll see how it goes. And Amir, would love to have you back on, keep us updated. One of the best sourced reporters, I think, in Israeli politics. And the book is called The Gates of Gaza. Whether you agree or disagree, wherever you sit on the spectrum, I think it's not only is it a gripping read, but it's I think you'll come away understanding more about the situation.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, guys, for having me. Really appreciate it.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.